Good afternoon. My name is Ben Olinsky, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Structural Reform and Governance at the Center for American Progress. Along with my friends from Court Accountability, I'd like to thank you for joining us for an important discussion on the role of courts in backsliding democracies and autocracies and what that means for us here in the United States. So let's get into it. Democracy is on the retreat worldwide, and the courts here in America should be a major warning light for us as to our own path. Under the leadership of Chief Justice John Roberts, we've seen an extreme right-wing majority on the Supreme Court abandon reason for power, to paraphrase Thurgood Marshall. In just the past few years, the court has arrogantly rewritten our nation's laws and arguably the Constitution itself by overturning laws, precedents, and rights that go back decades or even a century. Last summer, it invented whole cloth, a new sweeping immunity for presidents that likely made our nation's founders roll in their graves after fighting off an unaccountable monarch. And far from the inscription over its entrance, equal justice under law, the Supreme Court has transformed from a bulwark against special interests into a champion for them. Its justices have been mired in numerous ethics scandals, brazenly refusing any oversight by falsely claiming that ethics enforcement undermines judicial independence. In his most recent year-end report, the Chief Justice wrote that, quote, public officials, too, have engaged in recent attempts to intimidate judges, for example, suggesting political bias in the judge's adverse rulings without a credible basis for such allegations. Yet it's nearly impossible to understand countless actions by the Supreme Court and the lower courts over the past several years as anything but the result of political and ideological bias and preferences, hardly the balls and strikes promised by Roberts in his confirmation hearing. It should be no surprise then that the court's recent actions have led to historically low public approval. In a recent poll, only 43% of Americans approved of the Supreme Court's job performance. Even more concerningly, a shocking 7 in 10 Americans believe that the court places ideology over neutrality, a conclusion that is neither inaccurate nor surprising. But what is happening here is hardly unique. Let's look outward. Internationally, autocrats have weaponized judiciaries to prop up their anti-democratic agendas, transforming courts from neutral arbiters of the law into yes men for autocratic policies. We have seen foreign leaders pack the courts with justices more sympathetic to autocracy than the rule of law, change laws to prevent the judiciary from serving as a check on government power, and fire judges unwilling to toe the line. When courts fall, democracies are soon to follow, and the statistics bear up this bleak picture. A 2024 report by the VDEM Institute found that 71% of the world lives in an autocracy, a 23% increase from 2014. So joining us today to discuss these worrying developments are distinguished scholars and practitioners from across the nation, experts in everything from constitutional law to autocracy to judicial ethics. We'll begin with a presentation on the impact of recent Supreme Court rulings on American democracy by Michael Podhorzer, a senior fellow here at CAP and former political director of the AFL-CIO. Following his presentation, we will turn to the first of our two panels. Devin Ombres, CAP's Senior Director for Courts and Legal Policy, will moderate a panel on autocratic capture of the judiciary here at home. The second panel, moderated by Court Accountability's Executive Director, Alex Aronson, will look to the global perspective on courts and autocratic governments. At the end of each panel, guests will have the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. Please post your questions in the chat, and a member of our team will pass them along to the moderators. Thank you to our renowned panelists for sharing your expertise and time with us. And without further ado, let's turn this over to Mike.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you for this obviously enormously timely attention to this. And I'm just going to share my screen. Yes, thank you. So where I wanted to begin this is to ask us to think back to this day in 2008, as we're just 4 days away from another inaugural. And on that day, one that I think many of us felt was filled with hope for change, if we were told that when we came back for the inaugural in 2024, that there'd been major action on campaign finance, and it was that now there was the possibility of unlimited corporate contributions and dark money contributions, that democracy had been dealt with, but only to repeal the Voting Rights Act and permit partisan gerrymandering, that abortion rights had been dealt with, but revoked, that government integrity had been dealt with, but the laws were weakened or repealed, that gun violence had been dealt with, but only to repeal common sense state safety regulations, that white collar crime, especially in the shadow of the crash, had been dealt with, but only to expand the rights of defendants. That consumer protection had been dealt with, but only to make it more difficult for consumers to bring lawsuits and class actions. And that worker rights were dealt with, but again, just to make it more difficult to get them and to make it more difficult to organize unions. And so, on top of that, we would have to be told that 4 years earlier, there had been the first attempt ever to mount an insurrection, including calls to hang the vice president, but that coming out of it on the 4 days from now, that the person who summoned and incited the mob to do that was going to be sworn in again, and that the Speaker of the House had been an election denier, we would truly not understand how we could have reached this point, right? And that's because would have expected that all of those changes that I just described would have had to come through democratic process. But in fact, the opposite was the case. We have moved from branches that check each other to branches that coordinate with each other to prevent democracy, right? And so as we approached this election, before election day, there was all this talk about dictator on day one, and that was a threat of autocracy. And what I want to show here is that, in fact, we've had an autocracy. We've had an autocracy that's really more than an autocracy. It is a plutocratic and theocratic project that I'm going to go through, right, in these sections, as a campaign to repeal and replace the 20th century, to get the understanding that the Roberts Court is not a court at all, what the consequences are, and that we've long ceased to be our own rulers. So going in after the New Deal and the rights revolution in the 60s, the business interests, the plutocrats, the wealthy, the religious right, understood that they could not undo those things through any democratic process. As I said at the beginning, you were not going to get a bill through Congress that said the problem with democracy is not enough money from Elon Musk, right? Now, most people date the beginning to the Powell memo in 1971, but I think it's important to look past it because it's almost quaint if you actually read it, because what he was arguing was that business should do a better job inside an accepted legal framework. What happened instead, what we call phase two, is that the Kochs, the Olins, the Scaife, others understood that the way to circumvent the democratic process was not just to contribute to political campaigns, but to basically spend billions of dollars in the Federalist Society project on law schools, on journals, on making an ecosystem that would create a whole generations of lawyers ready to be legislators instead, right? And there's a way in which we keep hearing about different parts of that plan in isolation. But when you put it all together, you see that that actually hides the reality. The reality is not that you have some people giving campaign contributions to Mitch McConnell and others funding the Federalist Society. It is all the same billionaires, all the backing of all the same religious right groups. They are a team, right? And that creates a political doom loop, right? It begins with packing the Supreme Court and the federal courts, which then opens the door for greater power for plutocrats and theocrats, who then purge out of the party those who want to have integrity and stand in the way. They redraw the lines to make sure that not only is there the sort of gerrymandering we usually think of, but even within that, the districts are drawn to protect the faction within the party, and that ultimately leads to the end of two-party competition. And it isn't just for the sake of undermining democracy. If that were it, probably billions of dollars wouldn't have been spent. It's because what's going on is breaking down the barriers that for about a half a century had prevented them from converting their economic power into political power. And so with that going, you have a policy doom loop, right? It begins again by packing the courts, that then kneecaps the government, that kneecaps the workers, that kneecaps consumers, that creates a right-wing agenda. And some of those cases are on the left, right? You have to think of those as legislation, not as doing law, right? And you put that all together, and this is how we get the toxic world we're in, and why we have so little purchase on addressing it. Okay, so with that in mind, we'll look at the Roberts Court. Now, many people react to some of the kinds of things that Ben was saying by saying, well, all courts overturn precedent and such. But what I'm going to show here is just how profoundly different the Roberts Court project is from what an actual court looks like. And we'll begin by looking at what happened when the presidents changed from nominating a little bit more liberal or a little bit more conservative jurists to maybe take a little different take on established law to trying to nominate lawfare warriors, right? So here I'm going back to 1930. For that entire time, pretty much the average percentage of senators voting to confirm the justices on the Supreme Court was over 90%, right? Then you get lawfare. And you see on the Roberts Court, this doesn't look the same, right? It is not the same thing going on, right? Up until Clarence Thomas, every Supreme Court justice had been confirmed by senators who represented a majority of the U.S. population. Thomas was the first one into not to. And remember, this is the 2000 court, which we thought in 2000 had been blatantly political in Bush v. Gore. This is the court today. 5 of the 6 Roberts majority were confirmed by senators representing less than half of the population. Okay, ruled by Ipsy Dixon, and that's basically doing it because they can, making themselves a legislature. Right now, again, I said that usually the rejoinder is for, say, Dobbs is, what about Brown, and so on. Well, at the outset here, I want to point out 2 profound differences that are all the difference. The first is that it isn't as though the NAACP packed the courts to get Brown. It isn't as if indigent prisoners packed the courts and spent billions on law schools to get more prisoner rights. It isn't, and so on. And when you look at cases like the Pentagon Papers and all, it was with partisans holding up the law against partisans. The other thing that is really different, as you'll see, is that those decisions were either unanimous or close to it. And the Chief Justice went to great lengths to get as many on board, because when you do change law, you want to do everything you can to give people the impression it was with integrity, not to pursue an agenda. Right? Sam Alito, of course, like all of them, when they were at their confirmation hearings, were talking about respecting stare decisis. But when he was talking to the Federalist Society, he said it just is a Latin phrase that just means to leave it and when it suits your purposes, and that really it all comes down to however the judge wants it to come out. Okay. So here are the first series here is looking at major election related and voting related cases going back court by court. All right. So those are numbers of cases, and those are the numbers decided by 7, 8, or 9 by the Warren and Burger Court for elections. Right. These are the ones that were decided 6-3, and these were the ones that were decided 5-4. Right. What's on the right doesn't look like what is on the left. Right. This is a court, and of course, the 6-3s are ones after Coney Barrett was confirmed. Right. There's, as far as I can tell, only one major voting rights case that had anyone other than that set of justices behind it. Every one of the other cases, except Bush v. Gore going before it, had sort of bipartisan buy-in. Now let's look at civil rights. Again, these are all of the precedents that are overturned with the effort to get a majority, right? A unanimous, right? These are 6-3, and this is 5-4. This is what a court legislating looks like on the right. That's what a court trying its best to uphold the law looks like on the left. Okay, and so if you think specifically civil rights and the Shelby case, let's hear what Scalia had to say.
I don't think that's attributable to the fact that it is so much clearer now that we need this. I think it is attributed, very likely attributable to a phenomenon that is called perpetuation of racial entitlement. It's been written about whenever a society adopts racial entitlements, it is very difficult to get out of them through the normal political processes.
Right. He's like just saying the whole thing out loud. And what is this racial entitlement? And how did it get here? Here's how it got here. Right. That is a gallery of just some of the people who lost their lives to get the Voting Rights Act, and let Scalia's words echo in your mind that it was incumbent on them to get rid of this racial entitlement because the political branches are too responsive to the public. Okay. So what are the consequences? Judicial overreach is the means, not the ends. It's really dangerous just to think about this as a competition between the court and the other branches. It is the court acting behind that coalition that I described at the beginning, right? And I want to go through just how much in that doom loop it matters that you let the plutocratic money in the door, right? Up until the 2012 presidential, there basically was no outside spending to speak of in presidential elections, right? This is what happens, right? This time, $3.5 billion in outside spending, right? You look at the toss-up races for the House and Senate, the ones that decide who actually controls Congress. This is based on the Cook report. Again, until Citizens United, the number is 0. In 2024, every single one of those races, more money was spent by outside groups than the candidates running for those offices themselves. And it wasn't even as if it was speech on behalf of their interests. It was the crypto industry running trans ads against senators who felt they should be regulated, right? In terms of like integrating all of the different guardrails that have been taken down, right? We know with shame the Jim Crow era, where in the South we had rock solid one party rule. And in that period, they're called authoritarian enclaves, right? In the entire period, except for one little bit, the Democratic Party of the time had control of both chambers of the legislature, that's the bottom, and if they have the governor, they have the top. And so then you get the Voting Rights Act, and suddenly, look at that, right? There's beginning to be competition. You start getting even intra-party competition. You get Carter, a Clinton, Lawton Childs, right? There's actual democracy breaking out here. But the last line of defense against democracy is the court. And since 2010, you see in almost all of those states, they are going right back. You put the guardrails on in almost any area, we can have a democracy. You take them off and we revert back there. And to wrap this part up, here, most of you probably have seen this, the picture of Thomas and the talking about all that stuff. And to pull it back, Leo says, I don't think this is real. This being all what I talked about really happened since probably before the New Deal. He's literally dating when they want to make, when America was great, right? Which means no one in the room has probably experienced the kind of transformation that I think we are beginning to see. And remember that entire transformation was executed without a single vote being cast in Congress. And so as we look forward, not only to these legislative accomplishments by the court, we have to ask, how did we get to this point of someone who incited the insurrection being there again, right? And here we have to go back to the Roberts majority again and realize that in the last couple of years, right, when this has mattered, every time Trump's criminality has come before a grand jury, he's been indicted. Every time he's come before a trial jury, he's been convicted. Every time he's had a major case before a judge Trump didn't appoint, he lost. Every time there's been a question of whether he should face trial or he was guilty of it, a majority in surveys say he was. And every major case he's had before justices he's appointed, he has won, going against not just all these other actors, but most legal opinion, right? And we'll get to this a bit later. But if we were looking at this in any other country in the world, if we were looking at it in Hungary after this last election, we would not be asking like, well, we got to look at the exit polls in Bucharest. We wouldn't understand exactly what was going on. And the problem today is that we can't look at that mirror to ourselves, right? And so he has this get out of jail free card. So I want to wrap up by going back to another inaugural, but this a bit further back, of Abraham Lincoln, right? And what he said, remember, this is after Dred Scott, 1861, the candid citizen must confess the policy of the government upon the vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court. The people will have ceased to be their own rulers. Now, in 2009, this is John Roberts' response.
I think the most important thing for the public to understand is that we're not a political branch of government. They don't elect us. If they don't like what we're doing, it's more or less just too bad.
Lincoln understood it in 1861. Roberts understands it now. This is, as Ben was talking about, we'll hear later, this is autocracy, but it is not happening in 4 days. It is happening because of what's been happening for the last 19 years. And I will end there. Devin, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was an incredible presentation, so educational. Good afternoon again, everybody. My name is Devin Ombres. I'm the Senior Director of Courts and Legal Policy at the Center for American Progress. We're starting our first panel of 2, Autocratic Capture of the Courts, which I think Mike just did a fantastic job of laying out. Joining us is an incredibly austere panel that we are very lucky to have. First up, Christina Rodriguez, the Leighton Homer Surbeck Professor of Law at Yale Law School. Professor Rodriguez was also the co-chair of President Biden's Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. Also joining us, Mark Tushnet, the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law Emeritus at Harvard. and the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law Emeritus at Georgetown Law Center. Aziz Hook, the Frank and Bernice J. Greenberg Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School, will be joining us in about 10 minutes, and I appreciate his flexibility with juggling so many different asks of him. So in the meantime, I want to jump right in. Mike just gave us a pretty thorough rundown of authoritarian creep and the role that courts have played over the course of the last few decades. But last night, I would be committing malpractice if I didn't mention President Biden's farewell speech, in which he said, and I quote, "An oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead." He also said powerful forces want to wield unchecked influence for power and profit. I would love to hear your responses, Professors Rodriguez and Tushnet, to what Mike just said and what President Biden said last night in the scope of how the courts are potentially abetting this rising oligarchy in the United States.
I can address that first, Devin. I think that the influence of moneyed and corporate interests over legislation and regulatory policy is frequently shown in studies of how the government works. So President Biden was identifying a longstanding phenomenon. I do think is taking an especially stark form in the person of Elon Musk and some of the other hyper-wealthy individuals who seem to be exerting significant influence over the development of this administration. We'll see what their role actually becomes once they take office. And there is an argument that the influence of singularly wealthy individuals is even more insidious than corporate influence generally, because at least corporations are organizations that are structured in ways that hold them accountable, at the very least, to shareholder interests. But I think what the Musk-Ramaswamy combination in particular highlights, the advisory committee that they have been tasked to form, is a predictable onslaught that resonates with what Michael just presented, and that is an assault on the state that's coming. And that assault reflects a desire by people like Musk and other tech billionaires and other corporations to escape regulation and let the forces of economic development, especially the development of technology, run free and without oversight. And even though there's no doubt that the government could function better or serve the public interest better, to say that the bureaucracy should be cut by 70% is mindless. And to say that bureaucrats should be traumatized, as the likely new head of the Office of Management and Budget has said, is a threat to democratic and expertise-driven self-government. And as I think we'll talk about a bit in this session, the Roberts Court has both reflected and enabled this anti-regulatory drive through a range of decisions that are justified by theories of presidential power and theories of the separation of powers and the promotion of accountability, all of which are designed to denigrate and sow distrust of unaccountable bureaucrats and therefore of government itself. And there are many ways in which that has been accomplished by the court over a long period of time, some of which Michael identified in his presentation. But I think that is a significant part of what we should be worried about with the rise of the oligarchy, as President Biden put it last night.
And my reaction is I start out by thinking back about when there was a prior Gilded Era in the United States, at the end of the 19th century. And the reaction I had was, well, yeah, there was John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and the head of U.S. Steel, and they were really rich and powerful, but they didn't have offices in the White House. That's something new. So it's a new Gilded Age, yes, but it's a new Gilded Age. And I guess in terms of the focus of this day's session, I want to stress the doom cycle diagrams that we saw earlier. Because the thing about a doom cycle is that there's two ways of thinking about it. One is maybe you can identify a particularly strategic pressure point where you can intervene and break the doom cycle. But the other thing you can do is go after it at all of its manifestations. And that's what happened in the prior Gilded Era. The progressives and the populists developed a sort of comprehensive programs of structural reform of the government, direct election of the senators, initiative and referendums, recall of judges, a whole range of interventions, political interventions that you put together into a package that parts of which appeal to some people, parts of which appeal to other people, that manage to mobilize a movement against the proponents of the prior Gilded Age. So again, to focus on today's concern, yes, courts are a significant component of contributing to the doom cycle, but they're not the only one. And campaign finance is a significant component, but it's not the only thing. And I think the agenda going forward, obviously, people will focus on things that they are particularly interested in and specialized in. But and so we'll be talking about, the courts, and perfectly appropriately. But we have to keep in mind that there are these other things that we ought to be thinking about. Direct election of the president through either constitutional workarounds or a constitutional amendment. Doing something about apportionment in the Senate, really hard to do. But thinking about those kinds of things, those are important parts of the agenda. And I guess my primary focus, of course, has been on the courts, and it's not. I guess I want to caution against saying, well, this particular thing has to reform the courts, has flaws in it, and that other thing has other flaws in it, and so we can't do anything. The point is to get people to think about comprehensively reforming the government in ways that would enable reforms of Congress, the presidency, and of the courts.
Thank you so much, Professor. You brought up the old Gilded Age. I don't recall that Teddy Roosevelt, our grand trust buster, invited Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Carnegie to sit next to him side by side during his initial inauguration, like Musk, Bezos, and Zuckerberg plan on doing in the coming days. You had mentioned on the trust busting aspect, I think, we've seen Lena Khan and the FTC being very aggressive in pursuing these kind of anti-monopolistic, anti-oligarchical strategies. But the court is fighting back tooth and nail. And Professor Rodriguez, I want to direct this to you and Professor Tushnet if you want to jump in as well. Last year, the court overturned the 40-year-old Chevron doctrine in Loper-Bright, which was largely viewed as a judicial power grab, limiting both the executive and legislative branch's ability to enact their political agendas. But right now, as I just mentioned, the FTC is under attack under multiple different legal theories, including the non-delegation doctrine, which is a fringe legal theory. It hasn't been used in 90 years. It would overturn 100 years of precedence on the intelligible principle theory, not to get too wonky. But what does it mean that this Supreme Court and certainly the Fifth Circuit appears poised to resurrect a doctrine that has effectively never existed in American history, certainly not at the founding, about the court's attitude toward the other branches of government, and perhaps its fealty to driving forward this agenda that we've been discussing?
So your question alludes to the fact that the Supreme Court has granted certiorari on a case that raises the question of whether a scheme that delegates power to the Federal Communications Commission violates this non-delegation doctrine. It's a very complicated case, and it's unclear that it will lead to a resounding resurrection of the non-delegation doctrine. But the Roberts Court has been laying a groundwork for the potential return of that doctrine and seeking to control the administrative state in a variety of ways. And I think that will ultimately be one of the Roberts Court's chief legacies, is the constraint that's imposed on the bureaucracy. But as Mark points out, that is happening alongside the rise in power of an administration that also seeks to control the bureaucracy and make regulation more difficult and subject to the whim of the president. So it's important to see that there are two developments happening in the Supreme Court separation of powers jurisprudence, which may or may not culminate in the resurrection of the non-delegation doctrine. The first is expanding the power of the president to control officials within the executive branch, which this new administration seems very poised to do, to test the limits of what a president can do in rescheduling officials within the branch to be more beholden to the president and fireable by the president at will. And then the court's also empowering the judiciary to tightly control the bureaucracy or the civil service. It's done that with the overturning of the Chevron doctrine that you just described. Instead of deferring to agencies, courts will come to their own views about what statutes authorize agencies to do, which is a way of empowering courts. In addition, it's constrained the boldness with which agencies can regulate, requiring that major questions be dealt with only using express statutory authorities and not in the more dynamic way that agencies have typically updated old statutes to address new problems. And a key characteristic in this is a distrust of the civil service and the belief that bureaucrats are unaccountable, and that both the president and the court in service of Congress need to come in to control those bureaucrats. But even though the court purports to be standing up for Congress's constitutional role, it's pretty glib to say that it's opening up space for Congress to regulate, because Congress depends on agencies to make real the statutes that they enact in order to serve the public interest. And to get to the point of your question, if we do in fact reach the point at which the court is willing to revive the non-delegation doctrine, that will give the lie to a lot of what the court has been saying, that this is really about the formal separation of powers, and will instead make clear something that we can already see, which is that a lot of the move in this direction by the Roberts Court to constrain the state has to do with a strong anti-regulatory bias dressed up in separation of powers doctrine. And so if it truly does reinvigorate the non-delegation doctrine, it will reinforce this conclusion that that's what this movement to constrain bureaucrats has long been about. And these developments raise a range of concerns for the future of democratic self-government by weakening the government's ability to respond and adapt to changes in the world, to adopt policy that might help address some of the serious problems that are both longstanding and those that are novel. And so it is a suite of decisions by the court that have been exploited by those who share some of the underlying philosophy to put us in a position where there is cause to worry about the ability of our government to channel popular will and serve the public interest.
So I want to insert my cynical view about these questions. In the sort of traditional square dance, there's always a moment where whoever it is, the caller says, switch partners and dance. I think that's what we're going to see happening with Loper-Bright and the major questions doctrine. Because what those doctrines do is say, look, you can't rely, as Christina just said, you can't rely on old statutes to solve these new problems. You got to get new statutes to solve the new problems. Well, in the current world, and I mean, things may change, but it's really hard to get new statutes done except through very arcane mechanisms that have severe limitations on them. And so the Trump administration is going to be relying on old statutes to solve the problems that they perceive. Now, when the Biden administration tried to, and the Obama administration tried to rely on old statutes to solve new problems, the major questions doctrine kicked in and said, no, that's a major question. You can't do that on your own. You got to get Congress to do it. And now after Loper Bright, they're saying the same thing about, democratic controlled agencies. Once the agencies come under the control of Republicans, my view is that the courts say, fine, you can rely on the old statutes. This isn't a major question. This is just a technical detail, and that's fine. You can do all these kinds of things. So now, that is to say, go back to Michael's original presentation, the courts have become players on one side in a partisan battle. And they're going to go back to Robert's metaphor, it's hard, but they're going to be calling balls and strikes for the home team, for their team. And so, yes, there are these doctrines that are aimed at dismantling the administrative state, but to actually dismantle it, you got to do stuff through the agencies. And then these doctrines on their face say, oh, no, can't, no, you got to get statutes. But the cynical view is the partisan courts are going to say, fine with us.
I've been told that I have a gallows sense of humor, and my thought has been that this court is eventually going to rule that modern governance is unconstitutional in and of itself, unless it's coming from a certain policy directive. Professor Hook, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've been running in 12 different directions today, so we really appreciate it. As you can tell, we were just discussing the potential resurrection of the non-delegation doctrine as a power grab away from not only Congress, but also the executive. And if you want to jump in on that, fantastic. But I would also love to get your thoughts on President Biden's farewell address last night, discussing a rising oligarchy and the way that extreme wealth, power, and influence are using their unchecked power to profit and basically install themselves as political epicenters of movement, and how the court has played a role in allowing this to rise and could potentially abet this in the coming years.
Thanks, Devin. And and thanking you for inviting me and apologizing for being delayed. My institution has a decanal search, and there was a part of that search that I had to be elsewhere for until just now, which caused me to be delayed, for which I apologize for. I think I would distinguish two versions of your question. Has the court meaningfully abetted the emergence of what could be characterized as the conditions of oligarchy, or has it meaningfully translated the fact of a oligarchical class economically into a set of political entitlements or affordances which could be characterized as a political oligarchy? I don't think that the court is the cause of what could be characterized as the necessary social and economic conditions of oligarchy. I do think that the court is one of the range of tools through which a wealthy class or a class of wealthy individuals, and I distinguish individuals from corporate actors here, can exercise extraordinary privileges that are otherwise unavailable to rank and file citizens in the ordinary course of things. So why do I draw that distinction? I draw that distinction because, as I'm sure many on this call are aware, the phenomena of increasing inequality, where the increase in inequality is not actually driven by enlargements of the pool of the very poor, the extremely impoverished, but rather driven by an acceleratingly steep curve along the income distribution in the top decile, and in particular in the top percentile. That kind of increasing inequality is global rather than distinctive to the United States. It emerges in the early 1970s as Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Sainz and others have described, and it is as true of the notionally communist regime in China as it is in the United States. And it seems to me implausible to think that something as idiosyncratic as our mechanism of judicial review, which is influential in some parts of the world, but is certainly not adopted broadly, could be the cause of that. There are underlying structural changes in the flow of where labor is located, the constraints upon capital, and in particular, the rise of certain kinds of automation since the 1970s that explain the existence of a class potentially capable of exercising oligarchical power. That is not the court's doing. However, once you have a social class that is economically distinct, and the shape of the income distribution curve is such that it is quite plausible to say that the top 1% has a distinct and different set, not just of economic interests, but also a distinct and different psychology. There's a body of evidence that suggests that literally the rich think differently than the less wealthy. If there is that sociologically, psychologically, and economically distinct class, I do think it is fair to say that the court has abetted that class by identifying ways of installing law that translates economic hierarchy into other forms of hierarchy, in particular political hierarchy. And I think the most obvious example of this is in the campaign finance context, where the jurisprudence since Citizens United constrains the ability of the government to respond to the long-standing, and it's important to note that the following problem long predates Citizens United, but Citizens United ties the government's hands from responding to the long-standing differentials in responsiveness of American government to the wealthy and to the impoverished. I think that's the most obvious example of an affordance created by law that translates economic into political power. The other line of cases that I would flag, and I think there are many, but I'll end with this one, is the line of cases that has emerged somewhat unnoticed under the Roberts Court, whereby the court has placed substantial constraints on the ability of the government to enforce white-collar crime. There's a case, for example, before the court now concerning the scope of the wire fraud statute. A series of cases that in some instances have made corporate crime either extremely difficult or practically impossible to enforce. I'm thinking here of the Skilling case that comes out of the Enron scandal. And in other cases have eliminated the ability of prosecutors to check in practical fashion quid pro quo as between wealthy donors and elected politicians. Here I'm thinking of cases like McDonnell and the recent pair of cases concerning the honest services statute. I think there are other lines of cases that one can talk about, but I think that the best way of thinking about the court's role here is not as sort of the engine of oligarchy, but much more the maitre d' of oligarchy, providing the services that the oligarchs need to translate their economic power into political influence.
Fair. And certainly having a lovely vacation at a 500-room palace to attend operas and a music festival are just the perks of being the maitre d' there. I want to follow up on what you were just discussing about the McDonald cases and how this court has effectively deemed that public corruption is nearly impossible to prosecute in this, preventing criminal oversight, civil oversight in many capacities. But the court itself, as I just noted, has been involved in a number of ethics scandals over the course of recent years. And just last week, Justice Alito was receiving personal telephone calls from President-elect Trump while he has several cases either pending or on their way to the court. And meanwhile, Roberts has done nothing to alleviate any concerns about the court's lack of enforceable ethics and has rebuffed Congress's attempts at oversight, arguing effectively that any effort to hold the court accountable is a violation of judicial independence. It seems very worrying to me that the court is holding vast swaths of the public accountable. It is holding, it's purporting to hold limitations on federal agencies to act, but it is letting go of public corruption. It is refusing any oversight on its own behalf. So does this argument that oversight of the court is an attack on judicial independence, does it hold any water? And what should we be thinking about doing about this? And I will just open this to the panel as anyone would like to discuss.
So I'll start. I mean, my view is that what you're seeing is a manifestation of a kind of arrogance that on the part of the justices, and I want to say on all of the justices, this is not merely something that Republican appointed judges think. The public treat them as sort of really special kinds of people. We stand up when they walk into the room. We regard them as somehow, Richard Podhorzer once said, look, these are just, 9 out of maybe 10,000 people who could plausibly serve on the Supreme Court. We treat them as if they're really special kind of people. And when you treat somebody like that, you're gonna generate a sense that, well, they're special. They don't need any supervision. They can take care of themselves. I think we just have to start deflating them. Sure, they did. Most of them did pretty well in law school. That's not the only thing that matters in somebody who's exercising significant governance power. And a bunch of mostly, okay, smart lawyers. It's not the only thing we want out of our system of judging.
I would agree with Mark that the way in which many of the justices have bristled at the public coverage and the criticism of what appear to be really gross ethics lapses reflects that they live cloistered lives. I think some of that is just architectural and that they don't get out much into the world of the work that they do, but they believe themselves to be above reproach and the court to be above reproach. I think it's also worth saying that on the list of problems with the Supreme Court, this is probably relatively low on the list of importance in that it looks bad. It's a problem for the integrity of the institution. It's a it's an unforced error that they should be able to fix, but it's not clear that it's actually driving the ultimate outcomes of decisions. That's of course not always what ethics and conflicts of interest rules are about. I do think, though, the larger problem is with the view that Chief Justice Roberts articulates that criticism of the court has somehow become dangerous or has crossed a line. I think that the independence of the judiciary, as I think the second panel will likely discuss, is critical to the survival of a constitutional republic, but that's secured by their life tenure. And it should not lead to a culture where criticism of the judiciary, including because of the effects of their decisions on various communities or on the people or on the constitutional system, should be considered out of bounds. And that is in part because the court is a political institution. It's a lawmaking institution, and it's a part of our government. It's a critical piece of our system of government. And so for it to be immune from harsh criticism, including criticism that is about the consequences of their decisions, I think would treat that part of government differently than the way we treat the rest of government, and would be a grave mistake, and one that would not enable us to understand either when we're voting or otherwise participating in discussions about the future of the court, what's actually at stake when we appoint justices to the court or when the court's making its decisions. And that knowledge depends on engagement, including critical engagement with what the court is doing. So to the extent this court or the courts of appeals are trying to fend off criticism that questions what's happening in that institution, that's something that should be greatly resisted by people who are in a position to understand what they're doing and then comment and criticize.
I want to jump back in just to say, I think Christina was careful to say you can criticize them for the outcomes and the effects of their decision. I think it's perfectly appropriate to criticize them for the motivations of their decisions. To say that the circumstantial evidence that 6 of the justices are partisan Republicans in important decision-making when they are making some important, not always, but some important decisions, I think that's perfectly within bounds. The evidence is circumstantial. They don't say, I'm doing this because I'm a Republican, but the inference that you can draw from patterns of behavior seems to me perfectly, you don't have to draw the inference, but it seems to me perfectly within bounds as a basis for criticizing their actions.
I think I have 2 general reactions, both to the question that Devin, you asked, and to what my colleagues just said. One that can be summarized with somewhat contentless adage, context matters, and the second, which would go something like, it's not you, it's me. Context matters, I think, in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, I think it is surely the case that in other contexts of democratic unraveling, characterized by centralization of de facto political power in an executive branch, that investigations and even imprisonment of judges, or let alone lesser measures such as expulsion from the bench, have played an important role in consolidating or facilitating the consolidation of autocratic power in an executive branch. I think of the aftermath of the attempted coup in the 2010s in Turkey, which led to a mass purge of the judiciary, the academy, and the bureaucracy as probably the leading example of that. But there are also examples from Hungary and Poland. And so much depends on the character of the underlying judiciary that's being attacked, whether it is indeed in the pocket of some particular interest group or political faction. Much depends upon the character of the motives of the prosecutors or the people engaged in the attack. And I think that it's just unwise to think that there's some blanket answer to the question. So I happen to think that there is a gulf, categorical difference between the criticisms of the justices in the United States and anything that I just described. But I also think that I have to make a case for that based upon context. The other way in which context matters is I respectfully disagree with Christina's observation that an independent judiciary exercising robust power at the level of the Constitution is a necessary part of a meaningfully democratic constitutional order. Having grown up in a country that does not have that, the United Kingdom, and thinking that there are many ways in which that and other countries that have very different arrangements of courts, very different ways of assigning um, judicial power over constitutional questions. I don't see a strong connection between an independent court, particularly when it comes to constitutional questions, and any kind of a meaningful metric of a decent or a democratic society. So I think you have to, that's not to say that an independent court can't play a positive role. It's just to say again that a lot depends upon context, and I would eschew categorical judgments. Much more quickly on the it's me, not you. My view of the ethics scandals is that they're useful pedagogically, in the sense that they illustrate a basic underlying reality of alignment between the judges in question and certain political factions in our society, and that alignment would exist in the absence of the ethics scandals, and even if there were better ethics rules, the alignment would still obtain. But the ethics scandals actually illustrate the alignment, actually showcase it in a way that people can understand, people who are not, spending their professional lives looking at the judiciary. So I think of those examples as being pedagogically useful. And to the extent that I see a flaw, I would align myself with Mark and Christina's comments about the inordinate prestige that the justices are assigned in public life. But I think that a large measure of blame for that economy of prestige, that sense of distinction, is our fault. It's law professors' fault. It's the fact that the most prestigious, on some measure, form of law that you can do is constitutional law, as opposed to something that is the kinds of law that people practice that help individuals in their day-to-day lives, criminal defense law, family law, etc., are relatively low prestige in the legal academy. It's our fault in substantial part that the court has this sense of itself which is inflated, rather than a problem of the ethics disputes themselves.
Thank you all. We are running low on time, so I'm going to limit you guys to 2 minutes for just a closing thought. And I want to combine some of the questions that I've had with some of the audience questions, just because we're running out of time. And Professor Hook, during your TED Talk, you went into some detail about how judicial independence has to a degree shifted from founding principles to a form where ideological litmus tests are used, because the only way to implement an agenda is through judicial fiat. And you just talked about the deitization or putting on pedestal these justices. And it brings to the question, how do you balance the need to respect this institution and the rule of law when one of the institutions has arguably been hijacked by these anti-democratic principles, and we lionize them to the degree where, as you missed the quote from Abraham Lincoln earlier, but if we are allowing the justices to control every aspect of our lives, it runs afoul of the concept of self-governance. This is kind of a multifaceted question, but what do we do about this? How do we fix the problem that we're in, where we see this court that is aligned with the special interests, and regain some semblance of self-governance?
I don't think I have a here to there answer for you. I think that's a really hard question. I think that I would duck the real question and say that I think that the court, as it's currently composed and it's currently acts, cannot in any seriousness be viewed as an adjunct to or as an instrument for advancing the rule of law. I recently wrote a book about the rule of law, largely because I realized that I'd been using the phrase for many years and I had no idea what it meant. And there was one of those moments if you say something and you feel like a complete idiot and you're like, I should really fix that. And one of the joys of being an academic is that you can actually go and fix it. But as I understand it, the rule of law, as it's currently used, it really has two core meanings. The first is that the law be clear and publicly accessible, and not be somehow hidden or obscured. And second, and distinctly and differently, that the people who are invested with power by law themselves be held to the dictates of law. So there's two very different ideas. One is an idea of publicity and one is an idea of constraint. And I think if you look at the court's jurisprudence over the last 5 years, what the court has done is inconsistent with the idea of publicity, in the sense that looking at statutes, at the text of the Constitution, at whatever class of sources you think are relevant, that doesn't tell you what the law is going to be. It's what the law is at the whim of the 5 or the 6 people who decide what it is. So I think the court operates in a way that's antithetical to publicity. And if you look at the court's jurisprudence on immunity from criminal prosecution, immunity from disqualification under Section 3, qualified immunity, absolute immunity, state sovereign immunity, I could go on. The gist of the court's rulings is that so long as you are wielding the bloody red hand of the state, so long as you're not engaged in helping people, heaven forfend, then the law does not apply to you. So I think the court, I think the idea that one would lump into the same sentence this court and the rule of law is fundamentally a mistake, even on the terms accepted by the court.
Before Christina can wrap up for us, two quick things. One, Aziz's book is really good. It's very short. It's called A Very Short Introduction, and it's published by Oxford University Press, and people should read it. Second point, and this ties to something he said, how should we think about the court's decisions? I once took a course from a professor who students described as treating the subject as an incredibly close examination of the details of a rotting, dead rat. That's not a bad way, I think, of thinking about looking at the Supreme Court's decisions. They're rotting away at what a constitution ought to be doing. And we, as observers of the court, should be saying, this rat is dead. And they're just, contributing to the decomposition of this thing that may not have been all that great when it was alive, but certainly isn't great now.
Professor Rodriguez, you've got a lot to follow.
Well, Devin, you asked what can be done. And I agree with Aziz, it's an extremely difficult question, in part for the reason that Mark began with, which is that the court is part of a system, many institutions within which and actors within which are contributing to some of the problems that we've identified throughout the panel. And so it's not like there is one single obvious solution, short of remaking the world as a whole. But I do think it is worth thinking about within the narrow purview of the judiciary, what can be done to make that a better institution. And I think that we should think both in terms of influencing the judiciary and controlling the judiciary. And by influencing the judiciary, I mean, through winning elections, advocating for appointments, both at the Courts of Appeals level, but also, and especially at the level of the Supreme Court, of justices who have institutional humility and who appreciate the limited scope of their power and the importance of the political branches, and who are not enamored of totalizing theories of the Constitution, but instead exhibit a preference for pragmatism and problem solving. So that involves a lot of work, including actually being able to influence judicial nominations and changing the bitter process through which that occurs. And then I think it's worth considering controlling the judiciary as well. Mark alluded to some of the reforms that emerged out of the first Gilded Age, where there were thoughts given to how the court's power could be kept in check. One of the reform proposals that floated around at the time was the idea that Congress should have the power to override the judgments of the court, including on constitutional questions. It's worth thinking about how to enable that sort of democratic responsiveness to decisions by the court as a way of tamping down on the judicial supremacy that is driving the court's role, maybe some of its evolution to a dead rat, as Mark described it just now. Or it's worth investing energy in what might seem like a fanciful proposal, but in term limits, in ensuring that the justices have less power for less time, and that they're constantly renewed, and that the structure of the judiciary more closely reflects the outcomes of elections, as opposed to enabling control of old coalitions for long periods of time. And so putting intellectual energy as well as foundation money and other forms of organizing energy into efforts to propose these kinds of reforms may ultimately not succeed, but are one of the legacies of the last time we worked our way out of the kind of age that we started by defining at the beginning of this as what we need to try to escape. And so that's how we can at least play a role in thinking about how to make this a better institution within a better system.
Thank you all so much. I did not think we were going to be ending on comparing Supreme Court jurisprudence to a decaying rat, but that's 2025 in a nutshell, it seems like. Thank you to Professor Rodriguez, Professor Tushnet, Professor Hook. We very much appreciate your insights. I will plug Professor Hook's book again, The Rule of Law, A Very Short Introduction. I'm going to plug myself. You can follow me on Blue Sky at DOO-DC. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alex Aronson, the Executive Director of Court Accountability, to discuss global perspectives on courts and autocratic governments. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Devin, and what a fascinating discussion. So grateful to be here. Alex Aronson, Executive Director of Court Accountability. Really thankful to the Center for American Progress for co-hosting this event with us, for Ben's terrific introductory remarks and Mike's wonderful presentation, which I think should leave us all with a lot to think over. That conversation, I think, brought up so many just critically timely and important challenges that we face in our very delicate constitutional structure at this moment in time, on the cusp of the reelection of what I think many agree is an aspiring authoritarian fascist, and to acknowledge the role of the court majority and the long campaign to put this undemocratic system in place. And one of the reasons I was so excited, and our team at Court Accountability were so excited to put this event together, was to have this conversation in the context of the global rise of authoritarianism and the history of authoritarianism and the role of legal structures and courts and judges in that conversation. And I am honored to be joined today by three of the leading experts on these questions. And I can't wait to get into a discussion that I think will have a lot of overlap and intersection with the first panel because of this moment that we are in. And so I'll introduce our panelists. First, we've got Professor Margaret Satterthwaite from the New York University. Professor Satterthwaite is the faculty director of 3 different institutes and clinics on human rights and global justice. She also serves as the special rapporteur for the United Nations on the independence of judges and lawyers. We have Professor Kim Scheppel from Princeton University. Professor Scheppel is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs and the University Center for Human Values at Princeton. And finally, Jason Stanley, the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. So grateful to all of you for taking the time to share your wisdom and expertise with us. Professor Satterthwaite, I was hoping to start with you. Last year, you, in your capacity as UN Special Rapporteur, put out an amazing report on the improper influence of economic actors on the judiciary. Of course, that was very much part and parcel, I think the thrust of so much of Mike's presentation of that first conversation. And in that report, you wrote that for too long, economic capture has flown below the radar of those working to protect justice systems from improper influence. And you wrote that the report was intended to be a wake-up call. I was hoping you could help us understand how you've, in the context of that report and in the context of the broader work of the United Nations, define improper influence of economic actors. Tell us a little bit about how this has manifested both here and abroad, and maybe give us some examples about some systems that have proven most effective in ensuring judicial independence, protecting courts and judges from the type of economic and other special interest influence we talked about today and that your report addresses.
Thanks so much. So first, just thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I think the discussion already has been so rich, and I'm hoping that it'll continue. We badly need this conversation to continue in any different manifestation. So this report that you mentioned was very much about trying to create a category for analysis and action, and to put into the human rights setting the issue of economic capture of the judicial system. So the report kind of looks at 2 different manifestations of this thing, but to define it, it's really an organized effort to transform a judicial system's focus from the public good and from human rights compliance and enjoyment to private interest. And so it's a broad definition, in part because the point is to get more activity, more analysis, and more compliance around this issue. So there are 2 major manifestations that I look at in this report. The first is organized efforts to influence judges with money, with wealth and economic power. The second is forms of weaponization of the judicial system. So to go first to the influencing judges piece, we've already been talking about this, would be my opening kind of gambit there. We have been talking about the more subtle or harder to identify in many contexts ways of trying to shape the views of sitting and featured judges. So we see that in the US with the very organized decades-long effort of the Federalist Society and other actors to create a pipeline of judges with certain specific ideologies, of certain methodologies of judging, and certain views, certainly on the economy, on the role of the state, and on human rights. And just to be very specific, the US is not the only place where this is happening. Sometimes it is an organized effort in the way that we're talking about, and I imagine my colleagues will talk about this as well, but sometimes it's even more concrete things. So in Guatemala, for example, there's a system where high court judges are selected by commissions that are made up of law deans. So there has been the construction of certain kind of cardboard law schools in order to have deans to be put on those commissions. That's just another example to put things in context. But it's important also to really call out our outlier equality in electing judges at the state level. And election of judges is an open door with the situation we have after Citizens United. It's an open door to economic capture of the judiciary. And so I don't need to go back over that because that's already been discussed, but that is another example that I talk about in the report. Now, on the very concrete level, the other way of capturing judiciaries through economic power is simply determining who becomes a judge. And so that Guatemala example is a very good one. Now, you asked me, how do we avoid this? And I think the first and very obvious answer is we've got to have limits to the ability to use power, to use wealth and power in these ways. So Citizens United being a huge issue and obstacle for the kinds of work we need to do to dial that back here in the US. But then it's also looking at ways that money is entering into judicial systems through things like training of judges in ways that are not being transparent, of taking judges on lavish trips. We're all familiar with these things. And then, of course, having very clear and objective standards for transparency around these things. So we should know about these kinds of training programs, and we should be able to follow them and know that they are they will be made public. So I think I've talked enough there, and I'd love to hear more from my colleagues. So I'll refrain from giving you more examples right now. Thanks so much.
That's so helpful, and I think the Citizens United example is so on the head, because and it connects to something Professor Hook was describing around the propriety, the wisdom of having courts that have this breadth of power, particularly over constitutional meaning. And if, as you describe, as the report gets into, you have a special interest campaign that proceeds over decades to put in place judges who agree with this, outside special interest campaign to rewrite, to reinterpret the Constitution, to open those floodgates even further, it starts to become the doom loop that Mike showed us in that first presentation. And Kim, maybe I'll turn it to you, because I think your expertise and your broad study of judicial systems and courts in democracies and in authoritarian systems around the world and through history could be really helpful to help us situate this here. And going back to that first panel, where I think this theme that emerged was this very strong judicial power, which really has been aggrandized over the course of centuries, and particularly over the last few decades, to the extent that some scholars like Professor Mark Lemley at Stanford has described it as an imperial court. But and there are real idiosyncrasies about our judicial review process, the extent to which we have this kind of absolute judicial supremacy. But we're not the only country in the world that has a very strong Supreme Court. And I was hoping you could walk us through some examples, particularly at the cusp of authoritarian or fascist ascendance, where strong courts have been a bulwark against the rise of authoritarianism, and whether you think any of those examples could be instructive to us here.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for this, and thanks for the invitation, and lovely to see everybody on the screen and in the prior panel. Yeah, so judicial independence is crucial, especially crucial when you have powerful courts. So let me just say something about powerful courts. A lot of us have thought for a long time that powerful courts were a good thing. As Aziz Huq said in the last panel, they're not essential. So the countries that wind up on the top of the list of which are the best democracies in the world tend to have weak to no judicial review, like Nordic states, for example. So they're not essential, but in the places where they exist, where courts exist and have a strong power of judicial review, they can be absolutely important. I cut my teeth on trying to work in constitutional courts, both in Russia and in Hungary, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Those were places where the courts were absolutely crucial in keeping, what was really a very chaotic political process on track and kept it from getting captured. Now, of course, the problem is, and this is the problem the US has, the more powerful courts get, the more they present a target for capture, which is to say, if you've got people with autocratic aspirations and you've got a court that's going to stand on the way, the thing to do is then to try to capture the courts. So we're seeing that all over the place. So unfortunately, I worked at the Hungarian Constitutional Court for 4 years. That was the first target of Orbán's capture when he came back to power in 2010. The Russian Constitutional Court functionally dead. And now I think the US Supreme Court functionally dead. It's been captured, and it's been captured precisely because it stood the chance of getting in the way of a steamroller that was coming across the American political system, which was the Republican Party in the various forms it's gone through, over the last multiple decades. Okay, now there are still a couple of places where courts are still holding out and still doing amazing things. And this is where I want to call out the Supreme Federal Court in Brazil. That's a court which it's very much under attack at the moment. And, they have so much, I was just there a month ago, they have so much security because they're so much under attack. But this is a court that in the wave of Bolsonaro's attempt to kind of really, engage in autocratic capture of the Brazilian system, not only pushed back on some of his efforts to refuse to fight COVID, but more crucially, when he showed that he was leading an insurrection. Theirs happened to be on January 8th, 2 years after our January 6th, but it took the same form, right, of mobs attacking all the public buildings. After that, the Supreme Court disqualified him from running for office for 8 years. Our court said it was none of their business, right? Okay, so that's a big difference. That court, the Supreme Court of Brazil, has also now gone on to run Elon Musk out of the country when he refused to cooperate with their disinformation laws and refused to cooperate with their takedown policies. They finally forced him into a corner where he had to agree to comply to come back in. And they are really policing. They have a number of cases before them now on trying to regulate social media platforms. And just in November, there was a huge police file that dropped trying to indicate that Bolsonaro and his colleagues had engaged in a plot to overthrow the government, which included, among other things, a plot to assassinate one of the Supreme Court judges. And the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction for trials involving high officials. So one can expect that later this year, as that file works its way through the process, it may come to them to put Bolsonaro and his colleagues on trial. Okay, so that's a court that so far really stood up to the political, regime. So how come that happens? So the first thing that happens is that the court in Brazil has its own TV channel. They not only publish, like they don't only have cameras in the courtroom, they actually broadcast not just the announcements of the cases, but their deliberations. The judges debate with each other on public television. And they say they do this because there was always this worry that the court was captured, that the court was corrupt, that the court was, under the control of malign forces. The way that they dealt with that was by going more public, by making their debates transparent. Everything is on the record. In fact, that police file already that implicates Bolsonaro and his team already out in public. You could read it if you read Portuguese, and all the translation programs work if you don't. Okay, so they've handled this. They've kept the court popular. It's immensely popular. There's public opinion behind it. And it's because people could see it worked for them. Our court, of course, in the US, has taken the opposite tack, right? Behind closed doors, there are no cameras. They don't want to be seen. They don't want to be accountable. They're deciding cases now, very consequential cases, in a procedure that doesn't even get to oral argument or doesn't even get to public briefing, right? So hiding behind closed doors is one of the things that's led to our court looking as corrupt as it seems, right, in public. So let me just say one quick thing, though, in answer to this, because I see in the questions, everybody's saying, well, what can we do? Okay, so here's the good news about the US Supreme Court, which is that as they become increasingly captured by one particular political faction, they've also gotten worse at what they do, which is to say their opinions are terrible. You can't figure out, if you're a lower court judge, what exactly it is you're supposed to do with these decisions. The immunity decision was just one, Loper Bright is another, the major questions doctrine, we've been through some of these things. These opinions are so vague and hopeless that it leads to the possibility of action. And what's the action? The action is flood the zone and gum up the works, okay? What we need is more litigation, hitting on all these completely incoherent parts of the doctrine the court has laid out, and to lean into trying to convince lower court judges. By the way, many lower court judges in the US are not on board with what the Supreme Court is doing. And so if we can push back through those sympathetic lower court judges, and by the way, they're not just all the Democratic appointees. I've talked to some of the Trump judges who themselves are really frustrated and fed up with what our court is doing. So there's still room to use the courts against the courts, so to speak, to flood the zone with cases that show up the incoherence of what the Supreme Court is up to and that put pressure on it to actually change its mind, because between tanking public opinion and it's losing respect among the judiciary itself, the court is incredibly precarious and nothing is holding it up but politics. So I think there's a lot we can do.
So helpful. Thank you so much, Professor. And, you know, I come to this work that we do at Court Accountability from about 5 years that I spent working on the Senate Judiciary Committee while Trump and, you know, with his outside allies at the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo running judicial selection, were really turning the Senate into a conveyor belt for the confirmation of these extremists. And they were able to do it, you know, without much of a, you know, effort to stop them, right? I mean, of course, senators, you know, argued that nominees were disqualified. They made points that they asked them whether they would hold to existing precedent. But what we lacked, and what the other side very clearly had in these fights, was a popular base engaged around these issues. And I think you're right that, you know, the lack of transparency, frankly, the trappings of the legal language and the robes and the mythology that had been built up around these courts had kept people in the dark and produced this sense of helplessness, which, you know, as so much of your collective scholarship has shown, you know, is really a product, an intentional product of an authoritarian capture of government, so that people feel disempowered. And so, yes, I think, you know, I couldn't agree more, Professor Scheppel, that these litigation strategies are essential. And I think we've seen great examples of talented litigators, you know, poking apart unprincipled decisions like the one the Supreme Court handed down in Bruin on the Second Amendment, which has become an unworkable mess that has driven these judges nuts. And now, you know, it's going to be interesting and important to continue to put pressure on them. But it also strikes me that there's going to be a real political necessity to engage on this stuff, and I think it connects. And I wonder if any or all of you have thoughts on this before I turn to you specifically, Professor Stanley, on these questions, because I think what I saw was a real reticence among elected Democrats to level these types of criticisms that we discussed in the first panel, for fear that it would be perceived as an affront to judicial legitimacy or independence. And so I wonder if you have thoughts on what we can do to engage elected leaders, the media. I think the same reticence you can see in the media, and people themselves, to empower themselves against what seems like an unstoppable force, which in reality, because of these idiosyncrasies of our system, you know, it doesn't have the power of the purse. It doesn't have the power of the sword. It has the power of public trust, which it is quickly losing.
I don't know who wants to take that, but I can just say something really fast, which is that, you know, public opinion is a great resource. And it seems to me that one of the things that people who are upset about where the Supreme Court is can do is to generate more distrust in the court, which is to say, it's clear that the justices pay attention to their public opinion ratings. It's clear that the other judges in the system do too. And so I think, you know, one thing that frustrates me, because I spend more of my time with foreign judges than with US judges, is that in other systems, asking judges about how their courts work is something that academics routinely do, and that the press routinely does. This idea that they can get away with saying nothing, or that John Roberts' report, you know, dropped at a time of year when no one reads it, can accuse us all of, you know, almost treason, right, for criticizing the court. This needs to get pushed back on. We have to stop treating them all like they're so fragile, like as if they're going to break if we drop them. I mean, maybe we should try dropping them and seeing if they break.
Just a brief note too, and then I really want to hear from Jason Stanley. I think we need to reclaim judicial independence and impartiality. Those are for the public. They're not for the judges only. Of course, judges have their independence and impartiality that they need to protect. But the point of those structural requirements of a democracy is to ensure equal human rights for everyone. And so I think we need a discourse about how judicial independence and impartiality, which have to work together, and they have to work also with accountability, that's our right as people here in the US. So I think we need a popular discourse on that. And then I think we need to be insisting on basic things like a binding ethics code, things that are low-hanging fruit that we must simply insist on as essential minimums. And I agree with the discussion around transparency and more engagement with what it means to have an independent and impartial court.
I think this leads really nicely to the question I had teed up for you, Professor Stanley. Ben mentioned at the opening of this event the year-end report from Chief Justice Roberts. I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at it, but he pushed back, quite sternly. These are usually pretty staid reports, but he pushed back on public officials who regrettably have engaged in recent attempts to intimidate judges, for example, suggesting political bias in the judge's adverse rulings without, in his view, a credible basis for such allegations. And of course, he's saying this against the backdrop of mountains of evidence that have piled up, showing that his colleagues like Justice Thomas have taken upwards of $4 million from billionaires who have very significant financial interests in the cases before the court. Evidence of his colleague Samuel Alito flying a flag associated with the insurrection outside of his home while he was sitting on cases implicating that insurrection and implicating Donald Trump. And this it's ominous to me. I don't know if you agree, but it struck me as incredibly authoritarian to equate, as he seems to do, criticism with intimidation, or as he actually goes further to suggest that it leads to violence. And I know you've written so much about the importance of accountability in democracy, and here we are on the cusp of what I think seems clear, that many of the January 6th insurrectionists will be pardoned because of the court. Donald Trump has avoided accountability for his participation in those crimes against democracy. How do you process these questions of accountability and public criticism as they're arising right now?
Right. So I'm here mainly to learn from, because I'm not myself a legal theorist, but I think we're seeing right now, and this discussion reveals something about democratic political philosophy. A key democratic ideal is transparency. And once transparency goes, it's kind of hard to see how you have a democracy, because we have to have transparency in order to have accountability, in order to make judgments, in order to vote in an informed way. And so the fact that our system lacks transparency enables, we already have, as Kim pointed out, we already have complete seizure of the Supreme Court. It's a Trump court right now. It's there to serve the interests of the Trump regime. And so we have no transparency. As a result of having no transparency, all sort of critique is treated, as you say, as sort of illegitimate. You don't know what we're doing. How can you say that we're doing something wrong? Transparency is a central democratic ideal for a reason. So a few points on some of the topics that we've just discussed. I think we're all now used to what's happening. We all, I think, have a good sense, not just experts, but one thing that I've discovered by talking to people undergoing this democratic backsliding or move to authoritarianism is it becomes generally clear what's happening to ordinary people. And so we need to have some more discussion of how to fight back, how to, as Kim pointed out, change public opinion so that public opinion is mobilized and people don't feel this overwhelming sense of doom and despair. I think one tactic is to highlight the good people, highlight people who are doing what judges should do. and not just focus on the bad things. I'm guilty as the next person of focusing on just all the horrible things that are happening, but highlight the people who are being models in the press, in public opinion. And I think all of these, when you look at what democratic political philosophy says are the central democratic institutions, they're the courts, the media, and education. And you can see how they're all linked here. We need to think about how to use the media to raise attention about the courts, strategies. So we've got to both focus on the problem and focus on people who are addressing the problem. As far as education is concerned, we learn from, of course, all of these authoritarian countries, but as Kim has educated, obviously Hungary, they attack the education system by often placing education and media, making them susceptible to the courts and court judgments. So what I'm seeing in school, some law schools maybe that I'll go unmentioned, is a desire to protect the institutions more than a desire to protect democracy. So, people want to say, well, I want to make sure that my law school still has power, rather than saying I want to make sure that my law school defends democracy. And so what that is going to mean is hiring regime proponents into law schools, into education systems, to make sure that your law school still remains relevant. And that's something I think we need to, and that creates a kind of feedback loop where, in order for the institution to remain powerful and have these links to power, you have to give up on democracy. So I think reminding people about what the central democratic ideals are: democracy, free press, a free education system, impartial courts, though we can ask about the notion of impartiality here. These are going to help push back against, say, the bruised feelings of Rob. You want to know what we're doing? How could you possibly want to know that? We're sacred. That's actually completely undemocratic, that response.
That's so interesting. And maybe I could just ask you one follow-up, because and you mentioned you're here to learn. You're not a legal theorist. I think this is one of the things, right? These conversations are almost always with law professors, lawyers, legal practitioners who, for various reasons, incentives, identity, are attached to these institutions and almost can't really see what has happened to them from the inside, and have a real reluctance to criticize what's happening to their institutions, and are unwilling to do that in a way that is actually harmful in the long run to the independence and integrity of their institutions. So I think it's incredibly valuable to have sociology professors, philosophy professors, clinical legal professors that work in a global context to engage on this stuff. But the question I have is, one thing we've seen in the work we do to track the activities of this authoritarian network that is behind the capture of the courts is a concerted, multi-pronged effort to attack pillars of democracy, the ones you just described: government, education, media. And the impulse, I think, too often is to capitulate, to ameliorate, to find common ground and compromise. And so I guess my question for you is, and particularly if you have lessons to offer from a global context, is, particularly on that media question, when those efforts have succeeded in driving down huge distrust of the media. Some irony in that, as they say, criticism of the court is bad for the public legitimacy of the courts, but they're happy to drive down the reputation of the press. How can we get these messages out? How can we build awareness and hope around this stuff?
Media and universities. So our Bonds 2010 campaign is attacking universities. People forget the education component. The education component is central. Theoretically, we have to understand how the education component is central, but they always target universities. So yeah, brilliant point. They're complaining about the court's popularity dropping while the Republicans have had this, have been attacking universities and the media now for a decade. And I'm seeing terrible, I'm just going to speak about my own industry, universities. I'm seeing terrible mistakes being made by university leaders. One of the things that I'll just say it, our new university president is always saying is people don't like universities. And people don't like universities because, they regard us as too woke or whatever, and they regard us as too expensive. And some of that is legitimate. Universities are too expensive for a number of reasons. But it's also been the case that there's been a concerted attack on universities. And both our new president and our old president both said the same thing. Universities are unpopular if you talk about the humanities, but they're popular if you represent them as science and technology institutions and medical research institutions. And so we have to lean into that. If you look at like Yale today, they never mention any humanities in the media. It's only ever medical research or scientific research. Humanities will only come in insofar as it's like, oh, an Aztec building was found. So something completely apolitical. So what university leaders are instead of fighting this, instead of defending the things that are under attack, women and gender studies, which women and gender studies helps us understand what's going on, of course. Instead of defending these things, they're just saying public opinion is this, and who knows why public opinion is this. So they're acting like they have no agency. Our university leaders are acting like they have no agency. And they're saying the only way to preserve our institutions is hide the humanities, hide the things that we're attacking. So this is just abdicating responsibility and giving up democracies. A key fact to remember is that there are no liberal arts colleges in authoritarian societies. There are no but there are plenty of STEM education places. So there's a reason they go after the humanities, and university leaders and the media have to highlight that it's not about fun, it's not about ratings, it's about defending democratic principles. That's what universities are about. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing instead like, oh, we have to hide that we're doing that. And we have, as our president said, we broadcast into the public that we have, and this is their view. They don't like universities.
Very helpful. Okay, we're going to turn to some audience questions. Maybe I'll turn this one to you, Professor Satterwhite, because your report, I think, does such a good job walking through some of the reform measures that could be advanced, and you mentioned some of them. And as you mentioned, they're low-hanging fruit. We have the same perspective. We worked on, in the wake of some of these scandals around Thomas's gifts, very straightforward, low-hanging fruit type legislation to ban these types of gifts, put the same gift limitations on Supreme Court justices as members of Congress are applied to, bound to under federal law. And that polled at like 90% across ideology, across party. So maybe you could explore a few more of those reform ideas and what you think we could do to start to build political support to get those things across the line.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just mentioned some really important ones. I think that this is very obvious, but we need to demand a legislative fix for Citizens United, just to put that on the table. There is no reason not to have a binding ethics code. And I've heard this discussion in the press of, oh, it will threaten the independence of the Supreme Court. It's just not true. And I think we need to be equipped to explain why. It's a very strange thing that we don't have that. We are an outlier among nations. And I think we need to recognize that. It's extremely odd. And we also, I think, need to insist on people explaining themselves. I think we talked about this in the first panel, and this goes to the transparency point. But I think we should ask for judges to be talking to the public more. And that's something that, requires them to really break down what they're doing and speak to us. I also think, and this is going to sound a bit out of left field, but I think we have to insist on the protection of the security of judges. So When I think about what's coming down the pike, we do have a lot of very independent and careful lower court judges who will have a lot of cases coming before them, which could make powerful people very angry. It is really important that we protect those judges, their security and safety. So we know that judges have been subjected to doxing, to swatting, and unfortunately, as I'm sure everyone knows, a federal court judge's son was murdered a few years ago in a really horrible attack. So I think we have to insist on that at the same time as we're insisting on the kinds of reforms that we need at the top. We also, I think, then need to be talking about a substantive independence and a substantive impartiality. And that's about commitment to the equal rights of all. In other systems where you have an international human rights mechanism, like in Brazil, there is the Inter-American System of Human Rights. In relation to Hungary, of course, there's the European system. We don't have that here. So we lose our bearings. We talk only about the Constitution, and it becomes subject to these doctrines of interpretation and this kind of technical discussion. But everybody knows that a judicial system is supposed to protect the rights of all. It's supposed to ensure that nobody's above the law and nobody's below the law, the protection of the law. And I think we need to keep insisting on that, and that judicial independence is also about judges knowing that and placing that at the center of their work. One other thing I just want to point out that I haven't mentioned yet, the use of SLAPs, so strategic litigation against public participation. This is a way of weaponizing the judicial system. And we need to insist on, I think, really state-level anti-SLAP laws, statutes, so that judges can immediately identify SLAPs and get rid of them. It's one way that powerful, wealthy actors are able to really gum things up for activists, for journalists, for people who are just trying to report on what's happening. So those are a few of the things. I saw that there was a question about where to find my report, so I will put it in the chat so that folks have it. And I'll turn it over to the other brilliant panelists. Thank you.
So what can be done? So let me say one thing about law, which will pivot into some of the stuff that Jason was saying about education. So think about the way we train lawyers in this country. You have to go through 4 years of an undergraduate education before you get to 3 years of law school. Okay, so one of the things that does is it piles up any graduating lawyer with mountains of debt. And then what do? They have to go to work for a law firm's big law that will pay them the money to pay down the debt. We have this kind of machinery that's been producing lawyers and then judges for a long time that makes it very difficult for them to break free of exactly the economic forces that we were talking about have been engaged in capture of the judiciary. So one of my more radical ideas, which is not a starter, but somebody has to talk about it at least at some point, why isn't law an undergraduate degree as it is in almost every country in the world? To make it an undergraduate subject, so now it means you have less interdisciplinary training among your lawyers, but one of the things it means is that you also don't hold, people can major in law and then go on to do something else, as they do in most other countries in the world. So one of the reasons why I left law school teaching, and I now teach undergraduates, is that I think law is too important to wait to graduate school, that we need to have a broader public education about law. One reason why the courts get away with telling us what law is when it wasn't that yesterday is that people didn't know what it was yesterday. People don't know how outrageous it is when, for example, that immunity decision comes down from the Supreme Court and every trained lawyer can see it's lawless. But all the people who are not trained in law think the Supreme Court said it's law, so it's law, right? We need to broadly educate people about law so that they can push back. And one feature of that is undergraduate education. So like, what else can we do? So the other thing to do is America's great strength, and the reason why it will be harder to capture than a country like Hungary, which is small, is that its institutions are very pluralistic. So Meg just mentioned, for example, that the federal courts are a bit of a mess, but some of the state courts are fine. And the federal courts aren't a mess all the way down, right? It's just big and diverse, and it depends. And so, it's a system that there are going to be pockets of light and hope throughout the system, and we have to find out what they are, raise them up and protect them. And so all the courts aren't captured, just the Supreme Court and some other courts, but mostly the Supreme Court. Okay, the other thing on media and education, we have a massively pluralistic media system in which lots of the pivot media, lots of the legacy media are caving in. But there are lots of other media that are springing up and doing things. I have to put in a plug that this week, a group of people launched a website. It's now a Substack. It will soon be a bigger thing, called The Contrarian. This was formed when Jen Rubin quit her job as a columnist for the Washington Post because of the stuff that they were doing to grovel before Trump. And Norm Eisen is the other co-founder, but Harry Littman, who quit his column at the LA Times to join us, also is on board. And Contrarian, it's on Substack, and come and subscribe. But there are a number of platforms that are growing up to take the place of the media that are caving into political pressure. So support them, subscribe to them. That's something that can be done. Ditto with universities. So, I let me again put in a plug for my own. So one of the things Princeton did about 8 years ago was to say, we have a large endowment. We have a public obligation to do good things. So what are we going to do? We pivoted to having preferential admissions for first-generation students. We now have about 25% of our student body are first-gen students, and we promise all of our students, first-gen and otherwise, that they will all graduate with little to no debt, because that's how we use our endowment. Okay, so we can say, look, we're the upward mobility school. And I think the faculty is on board, everybody's working on this. And so I think that's one way universities can pivot to realize, a public mission. And so, there's just a lot of things like that institutions can do, even within this very contested space, in order to be able to, enlarge the landscape beyond the courts as institutions that might be able to help in this present moment. Let me just finally say one thing, because it's a PS on something that Meg said. It's true that one of the things that courts have as their obligation is to protect equal rights for all. But I think the other thing that courts have an obligation to do is to defend something that I've called sustainable democracy, which is to say that democracy is not just about whether you had an election yesterday. It's about whether you go on having elections that can credibly be thought of as free and fair. That requires ensuring that there's a level political playing field. It requires ensuring that you don't have such an overreach of executive power that this starts to constrain the political space. And so we need to articulate those things that we expect of courts in order to be able to put this on the agenda, call them out when they violate these kinds of norms, and try to, as far as we can as citizens, to push back against the institutions that are going off the rails into supporting and defending autocracy. Thanks.
It's amazing, Kim. Thank you so much. I think we got 1 more minute left, and we can perform the minor miracle of ending exactly on time. So, Professor Stanley, maybe you could have the last word here on this question.
Well, I think we face these long-standing structural problems, like when we have no publicly funded media or very little publicly funded media. Capitalism requires that media goes for ratings rather than news, and so this constant flood, so we don't get some of the substantial issues that face us. We heard a lot about Hegseth's personal life, but we didn't hear that he wants to use the military against college, that he thinks college professors are vitally, we didn't hear a lot about his views. So I think we've got to shore up the democratic institutions of the media, the universities, as well as the courts, and bear in mind what our democratic ideals are and the difficulty we have the difficulty we have of realizing them, given the structural barriers that we already are, as it were, coming into.
Thank you so much, Jason. With that, I think we'll wrap things up. I want to thank each of our panelists again for taking the time to join us and to share their amazing wisdom. Thank you for the work you are doing. I commend everybody watching to really go and check out the incredible scholarship and work from these professors here. I know, Jason, you've got a book recently out, How Fascism Works, that addresses a lot of these issues you're describing on the attack on higher education. Thank you to CAP. and the incredible team that has helped us to put this together, including the production folks. Such impressive work over there. They've got such a wonderful team to work with, and we're really grateful for their partnership. And check us out at Court Accountability. We're a newer organization, and we hope we hope you can get involved with our work. We're at courtaccountability.org, and we're really grateful for your engagement and for your commitment on these issues. That it's going to be a long slog ahead, but we're going to keep fighting, and we're going to do it together. And so with that, we'll close things out, and thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.